Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we're wrapping up our series on biological evolution. So I'm going to begin by asking, do you think we did a good job of reconciling the two views about, religious beliefs and evolution?
Well, that will be for our viewers to decide. But from
true.
my perspective, we've tried our best to show the two sides of this question. One, the scientific approach, and two, the theological or religious approach. And among the religious approaches, we saw that it's not just one approach, but there is a variety. There are some people who think that we can reconcile evolution with creation, and some people who think that the two are two separate things. And we have tried in the series to give evidence that the Quran, at least, is compatible with the modern theory of biological evolution.
I was checking online, and it seems like this particular topic of evolution has garnered a lot of interest from our viewers. So, just out of curiosity, what would you say to some viewers? Because our whole premise with this, was to highlight that there is a balance, right? You can believe in religion and you can believe in evolution. What would you say to someone who's watched our series and isn't convinced that that's a possibility?
Well, I would just encourage them to read more. There are some good books which are written by some Muslims, or at least books presenting an Islamic perspective, showing that there is a marriage between evolution and creation in what we have called creative evolution. There is a book entitled Islam's Quantum Question, and another entitled Islam and Biological Evolution. So I would recommend these books.
Okay, and what do you hope our viewers have taken away from this series, other than the obvious point that we've tried to highlight that there is creative evolution, but some other key takeaways that you were hoping viewers would take away?
Perhaps we can be future looking from here. Like, what has the series brought us to so far?
Yeah.
Many people have been asking, as I see the questions posted in response to our videos, what do we say about Adam and Eve then? And that is a bigger question that we did not tackle directly, but if we had time, we would go more into details in looking at the Quranic passages that deal with Adam and Eve. And we would point out that Eve is not specifically mentioned by name. Adam is mentioned, and it is not specifically said in the Quran that Adam was the first man, though Muslims have generally accepted this to be the case. From the evolutionary perspective, it is known that we descended from a woman who lived some 200,000 years ago, but descended is not exactly the right term. In tracing the mitochondrial DNA in humans now, scientists can reconstruct and hypothesize that we inherited that mitochondrial DNA from a woman who lived approximately 200,000 years ago.
But is this would this point have been in the Quran?
And no.
So then what would you say to someone who says, well, that wasn't in the Quran, so how can you make that conclusion?
Yeah, so there are things that we learn from the Quran, and then there are things that we learn from outside of the Quran. The only question is, are these two things incompatible, in which case we have to choose one and leave the other. But if there is no incompatibility, then we can choose them both. It may be that the Quran doesn't tell us how to change a flat tire, but the owner's manual for our car tells us how to do that. So the two things are not incompatible. You can have your Quran in your car, and when it's time to change a flat tire, you bring out your owner's manual for the vehicle. So not everything is in the Quran in those details, and so there is scope for a Muslim to get information from sources outside of the Quran, from observation, from empirical evidence. And so this is what we have here. As for the inheritance from Adam, it is now known that all men have a Y chromosome, which is inherited from a man who lived approximately 200,000 years ago as well. Now, the only thing is that you can't prove that this man and that woman, the Y chromosome Adam and the mitochondrial Eve, lived in precisely the same year, in the same time, in the same place, and that they were married. But that does not, or should not, trouble Muslims, because the Quranic story about Adam and Eve does not go into that great detail as does the Bible. And so if anyone would have difficulty with this, it will be those who take the Bible literally, because it presents Adam and Eve as the first human beings to be created and all human beings having descended from them. And that becomes difficult to reconcile with the modern theory of evolution. But from the brief mentions of Adam and Eve in the Quran, without naming Eve, there is much scope for accommodating the modern theory of evolution.
So what do you do with that part where you did say that it is difficult to reconcile modern theory of evolution? How do you bridge that?
Well, of course, the difficulty, as I said, is mainly felt by Christian writers on the subject. And a recent book written by Dennis Venema, who is actually a lecturer at Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia, and Scott McKnight, a known Christian evangelical scholar, very reputable. In that book, they try to deal with this question, and one of the approaches Scott McKnight suggests is that we can take the story of Adam in the book of Genesis as a sort of literary Adam for Christians. So Christians writing the New Testament portion of the Bible are referring back to the story of Adam. So what he would like to say is that the Christian writers of the New Testament, formulating specifically Christian doctrines, in referring back to Adam, are not referring back necessarily to the historical Adam, the actual Adam who lived in history, but to a literary figure, a person who is known from the Genesis story, let's put it this way.
Okay.
So it's Adam in the story. It's like when we, for example, if, I don't know if this will too trivialize the issue if I put it this way, but at least our viewers will understand. If we speak about Alice going through the looking glass, now someone may get the impression we're talking about an actual person named Alice who lived at a certain time and place. But those who know the story know that we're talking about Alice in the story of Alice in Wonderland.
Yes.
So in a similar way, Scott McKnight is suggesting that when Paul, for example, in the New Testament is writing about Adam and the sin we inherited from Adam, it's not necessarily that Paul said that we inherited sin from Adam, but Paul said through Adam sin entered the world, and and so on. So in the way that Paul was speaking about Adam, some people may have gotten the idea, and in fact people did get the idea that he was talking about the actual historical person who lived some time ago. But Scott McKnight would like to posit now that Paul was referring to the literary Adam, Adam in the story of Genesis, without necessarily insisting that the Genesis story is actually a description of some events in history.
That's very interesting. Do you think, just going on the topic of thinking and looking ahead, we don't have a lot of conversations about biological evolution within the Muslim community. I think this is the first time where I actually had learned a lot as well about it. Do you think we as a community need to start having these conversations beyond just when it comes up kind of thing?
Yes, there are two things I need to say about that. One is that, as you said, there hasn't been a lot of discussion, and the Yaqeen Institute, which is set up in the United States of America with a website that has very impressive content, has an article in which some of the problems and the doubts that Muslim youth are experiencing nowadays are highlighted, and the very goal of this website is to deal with those issues that cause young Muslims to doubt their faith. And one of the issues highlighted on that website is the theory of evolution. And an article on that site identifies the problem by saying that in speaking with a variety of Muslim scholars about this, one gets the impression that the scholars themselves are not prepared to deal with this. They just haven't studied the issue, and they will just give some broad statements regarding it. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is that actually some attempts have been made to deal with the subject of evolution. There was a Nazarite scholar who actually proposed that the theory is compatible with what we believe. And the matter was brought to the directors of Al-Azhar University, and they had to form a ruling about this. and their ruling actually said that what this person is proposing, we're not accepting as fact, but at the same time, we're not ruling it as outside the scope of admissibility. Related to this, there was a scholar in the United Kingdom whom I respect very much, Usama Hassan. He is a physics lecturer, and at the same time he's trained in Islamic sciences. And some years ago he came out boldly proclaiming that the theory of evolution is acceptable to Muslims. But his statements about this were much misunderstood, and eventually a death threat was made against him. And
he was based in the UK,
in
right?
the UK, yes. And due to that, he made some statements which may be seen by some to be retracting his views, or it may be seen that he is just trying to pacify those who were crying for his life.
So what do you do in that kind of situation, right? So there are imams and scholars who are starting to talk about it, and if they have a different view than what has been the traditional view, you're being threatened. So then and then you do know that you need to talk about it because youth are going through it and other people are questioning it. So then what do you do?
So we have to walk a fine line. At the same time, we have a great responsibility to speak what we know. According to the best of our abilities and circumstances. There may be some scholars in some circumstances who would not feel themselves at liberty to speak on these issues, and some others who would feel themselves at liberty to speak. It depends on personalities as well. Some people are more bold, some are more timid, naturally. So we ask God for His guidance and help and protection, but it's our responsibility. I myself feel a great burden of responsibility. I don't want to show up on the day of judgment and God would ask me, okay, so you knew this and you knew that this could help the youth. Why didn't you say something? So even if saying something will actually lead to some backlash or some detrimental results in this life, I'd rather be happy with God in the life hereafter.
I always admire the way you deliver and teach. Thank you so much, Dr. Shabir.
And thank you for having me on the show.
If you want more of Let the Quran Speak, you can watch previous episodes or new ones by subscribing to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/QuranSpeaks. Stay updated by liking us on Facebook and following us on Twitter @Quran_speaks. And when you're on the go, listen to our podcast at QuranSpeaks.com.